So tonight, again, I have some good news and I have some bad news as usual, right? The bad news is we suffer a fundamental disadvantage because I know you people, and you do not get up in the morning thinking about what you can do to control other people's lives. That's not how you think, right? We don't think in groups, but we do care deeply about the ultimate minority, the individual. There exists a vast network of money and influence that Matt is going to describe tonight for just the opposite. Those not fans of liberty are highly organized beyond our wildest imaginings. They use generic and innocuous words, positive-sounding words like justice, research, democracy, citizen, to smuggle in policies that embolden collectivism. And now it appears we are in the battle of billionaires. Right? Elon went after George Soros and Bill Gates this week in tweeting questions about who is funding the groups, forcing companies to boycott Twitter unless they endorse and insist on censorship. Clearly, the behind-the-scene powers are not necessarily what they seem on any side. And often it seems that we are playing checkers while collectivists are playing chess. The good news is there's a growing force of brave and inspirational people shedding light on forces that wish to limit liberty. Tonight's speaker also promotes the work of a Forum alum, Dan Bongino, in his role as content manager for the Bongino Report. And I really want you to check out the Bongino Report if you're not doing it daily, because it is meaty and good. And Matt works really hard on it. Serving in that role is by itself obviously a significant accomplishment, as we know how fiercely Dan tirelessly fights for liberty, for our country, and for our freedom. And by the way, I would like to thank Dan for giving Matt the night off to be here with us. It's a sacrifice, and please let him know that we are so grateful for his wonderful return to health. That Dan was in our prayers. But Matt's body of work stands on its own as he applies his talents as an impressive researcher and writer to the goings-on of political rainmakers and players. A prolific author, Matt has written on the subject of tonight's talk, this book, The Man Behind the Curtain, Inside the Secret Network of George Soros. In the back of this book, well, just get an airsick bag, actually, when you read the back of this book, because it has the voluminous list of organizations that are behind this stuff. Okay, he's also written Dumb and Dumber, How Cuomo and de Blasio Ruined New York, Debunk This, Shattering Liberal Lies, Spygate, and back in 2013, The Voice of a Young Conservative. Please help me in welcoming Matt Palumbo.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm always honored when people show up, and I cannot think of a better way to spend a Tuesday evening, so very good choice. I like many of you, have been, I guess, fascinated by Soros. I've known who he was since, I think, 2009 or 10, and more as just a background figure. I've just sort of used to, in the internet comments section, seeing him being blamed for all kinds of things, and having looked into it many years later for the book, they're for the most part true, actually. But it's a large motivation of the book was this guy's a massive network, as I outline in the book, around $32 billion he spent in the past 3 or 4 decades. And I just figured, you know what, let's try to see, well, what exactly is 100% true, what's not, what's close to the truth. And I just really went from there. And you know, in researching Soros's life, I found obviously not on the evil parts, but you know, commonalities between me and him. Me and Soros have been very fascinated by media and its power from a young age, and by finance. In fact, I remember once when I was in 7th grade, and I have no idea what kind of vibes I was giving off in 7th grade, but I had a math test, and it was something like, you know, one of those, you have this many apples to buy question, and there was in parentheses, for Matt, there's no sales tax. So apparently I was a little financially savvy in the back in the 5th grade or whatever that was, but Soros was similar in that from a very young age, fascinated by media. He started his own newspaper when he was 9 years old, which yeah, I can't imagine was a very impressive work, but just shows where his mind was at. And my fascination with media, and it sort of goes beyond that. You know, my parents never really forced an ideology on me. I mean, I knew my family was Republican. I would see the O'Reilly factor on in the background. But I sort of noticed from, I would say, fifth grade onward, there was an attempt to indoctrinate everyone with what I would call a default liberalism, in that you go through the public education system, it might not be most teachers are liberals, but the ones who are going to talk about it are liberals. And I think we've all had that experience in our life where liberals just kind of act like everyone believes what they believe. But that's just one facet, and that's 12, 13 years of your life where you're basically hearing one perspective from people who you're told are educators. And it would go beyond that. I mean, I was not that politically inclined at a young age, but I listen to a new musician, I listen to I see a new actor, I go on their social media. There's pretty much a 100% chance it's going to be a left-wing view. And Soros, to a large extent, is contributing to this. And it's the effects ripple onward in that really the younger someone is you can convince them of an idea, the more likely they are to hold it forever. It really explains the push between indoctrinated children. But Soros even came up with a name for it. It started off in his financial career, and he called it reflexivity. So it first started as a financial idea and then turned to media. And his theory was, and I think it's actually a brilliant theory, that in financial markets, expectations will create their own outcome. So you see this with any bubble, like with housing 2007 through 2009. Everyone thinks housing is going to go up, everyone buys housing goes up until it doesn't. And Soros used this idea in his career with hedge funds, but realized, well, we can do this with media. We can create expectations in people's minds of things that are going to happen, and then they'll filter reality through that. So, I mean, there's a million examples I could give. One that comes to mind recently was during lockdown. I mean, you remember the beginning of 2020, if you wanted a haircut, you were a grandma killer. And then you fast forward to May and June, after the death of George Floyd, it's get out on the street, scream and protest, or you want people to die. Now, listen, none of us are fans of lockdowns and all this stuff, but when you got, I think it was 10% of the country, that's 30 million people, all crowded together screaming, it's common sense, coronavirus would probably spike after that. And you would see all these stories, though, during the protests, sort of trying to create a narrative ahead of that. So they would publish stories like, hey, there might be a spike in cases 2 weeks from now, but don't blame the protests, blame this instead. And it's just sort of an effort to reframe people's minds. And we see this sort of with the everything is racist narrative. I mean, you can go on Google, I mean, I don't recommend you use Google, but they're the best to exemplify this, and just type in is, and then leave a blank space, and then racist. And you can fill in that blank space with mangoes, there's an article arguing it's racist. And it's part of what I think is sort of an effort to destabilize faith in America and in our institutions, in that if every possible inequality, if every difference of outcome is racist, how can you trust any institution? And another big thing that's big with Soros and the liberal media as a whole is just repetition. When you repeat something time and time again, you kind of feel like it has to be true. I've noticed this with liberal friends who are educated but not cognizant of the fact that the entire media is lying to them, where they'll say, and from their perspective it's common sense, it's, hey, NPR, CBS, NBC, they're all saying the same thing, how could they be wrong? Now, as someone who works in media, I can tell you with pretty high certainty that 99% of journalism you see is cut and paste. They see a claim, and then it's just repeated everywhere. No one really looks into anything. During COVID, there was all these stories of, there was one story where it was that people were taking ivermectin to the point where the consequences were overwhelming hospitals, and then this one hospital couldn't treat gunshot victims. So I thought, well, that seems unlikely. And I think 2030, it made mainstream coverage, CNN covered it, and I thought, seems a bit unlikely. So I looked up the city this hospital's in, and not a single person had been shot in 3 years. And it got to the point where the hospital had to put on their website a disclaimer, no, none of this is true, we're open, come here, don't be afraid. So this is sort of the impact of media. And Soros, there's, in the book, I link him to around 200 different media outlets. And I mean, I don't list every single one, but I list the household names. And it's, CNN, MSNBC, CBS, ABC, The Economist, any really three-letter organization. And they have this effect of just, they play cover for Soros. So anytime you see a story about Soros, it is going to be in the context of defending him. I can't remember who it was who first noticed this, but it's once you see it, you can't unsee it, that when a Republican screws up, the story in the media is this Republican just screwed up. If a Democrat screws up, it's Republican outrage over Democrat action. The framing is the Republicans are weird because they're upset about something. And you'll see this happen with Soros, where it's always, conspiracy theorists target Soros, and the truth of the claim is never looked at. So one of the biggest things, and I kind of opened the book with this because it's one of those, I wouldn't even say half truth, I'd say 95% truth claims you'll see in the comments section, and that's that Soros had some sort of connection to the Nazis. To say he was a Nazi soldier is hyperbole, but it is true. When he was younger, he grew up in Nazi-occupied Hungary, and this was in the early days of the Holocaust. The Nazis were still largely recruiting. They would enter an area, they would recruit from the local population, Jews who obviously know who the other Jews are. And I think a lot of the Jews that worked with the Nazis sort of were under this false impression they might be spared. That would, I think, be the most common sense. But Soros ended up joining one of these Jewish councils. He would serve deportation notices. And this is the one damning story I found about Soros that he's tried to deny and the media has tried to play cover for. In fact, in the book, I have probably a half dozen or so quotes where he is very openly egomaniacal, which I thought was a bit refreshing, although a bit evil. And they'll try to claim that he was taken out of context when he himself told the story. Glenn Beck, I think, actually deserves a lot of credit for blowing up this claim. So just to give any background for anyone who hasn't seen it, back in 1995, Soros was on 60 Minutes, and Steve Kroft asked him about this, and it seems like was trying to give Soros a way out of to explain it, and said, well, hey, I mean, you're in a position where you had to do what you had to do, and Soros outright denied it and said, no, it's something I enjoy doing. He even sort of made it. I mean, he's always making finance analogies. He said something like, well, the opportunity was there to save myself. Actually, I don't even think he said save myself. The opportunity was there, and hey, if I didn't do it, someone else would have done it. So it's annoying to have to deal with the fact checks because to refute the fact checks of this claim, you just watch the video. But you read the Washington Post or any other organization where their journalists have some sort of link to Soros, and they'll completely deny it. They'll just say it was out of context. They won't tell you what the context is, so I have the transcript in the book. And even more damning, though, Soros is contradicted on this by his own father. So his father wrote an autobiography that apparently only I bothered to read because no one mentioned this, but he tells the same account of what happened, and it's verbatim the 60 Minutes account. He even said he tried to dissuade his son from doing it, and later regret, and he didn't seem to have any regrets about it. And Soros' own biographer said the same thing. So it's just kind of impossible for him to deny that. Now, after he served in that role, he ended up going into hiding. He adopted a Christian identity. His father set him up with someone who's only known as the Godfather. And this man probably single-handedly saved George Soros' life. Now, from when that happened in the 40s to when this guy died in, I believe it was 2009, 2010, he is not mentioned once by Soros. Soros not once has thanked this guy, acknowledged him, addressed him, nothing like that. We didn't find out about his identity until 2018. So this is just, I think, just shows light to who he is. And, you'd think you'd at least have the self-awareness to pretend you had some sort of, apology for what happened or try to justify it. But he is, as I said, sort of an open sociopath, and it just kind of shines light onto who he is. Another thing from his early life as well. So he got his bachelor's degree, master's degree, and PhD at the London School of Economics, obviously in England. Now, he is Jewish, but not practicing, and he realized when he got there he wanted to make some quick money. So he went to a charity that was supposed to help practicing Jews. He had broken his leg recently, and they denied him because he wasn't practicing. And he just kept going and badgering them and trying to guilt trip them until he gave them money, and then would later brag about how he basically defrauded that charity. So also just all these little teensy events in his life just kind of shine light into what kind of guy this guy is. So after school, he moves to America. He's very highly influenced by a guy named Karl Popper and his idea of what he calls the open society, which on paper seems like a sort of libertarian-ish view of the world. Soros' interpretation is much more darker. And he, in fact, views America as the antithesis of what he calls the open society. Ironically, his teacher, Karl Popper, says he sees America as the embodiment of it. So there's quite some disagreement there. Now, after he comes to America, he starts a hedge fund. His goal is, I want to make $100 million, and then I'm done forever. He makes $100 million, and then makes another $40 billion more on top of that. Yeah, I guess what's 100 million versus 40 billion there? Now, his entrance into politics starts in about the 80s and 90s, and it's sort of the beginning of this sort of myth about his political philosophy. So a lot of people who I guess you could call globalist capitalists, the Michael Bloomberg types who, on paper are pro-capitalist, but not the version of capitalism that we're for. There's this myth that he helped all these communist countries transition to capitalism, which from our perspective, we would say, great. But that's not exactly what he did. I mean, he was exploiting a situation, a very rare situation, in that, when the Soviet Union goes capitalist, well, you have all these assets that are owned by the state, and now the public has to own them. So what do? Well, you sell them off. And unfortunately, there was a lot of corruption there, and benefiting from that corruption was Soros, who would buy up all these assets for pennies on the dollar, and then resell them. But that's just, it was not a pro-capitalist thing. If it was, the ideology is irrelevant. The opportunity for money was there, and he took advantage of it. One of the earliest countries he got involved in was Ukraine back in the 90s, obviously a former Soviet country, and one prone to corruption. And the lasting impact of his influence is quite incredible. So he's donated around, I think, 200 million or so since the 90s to that country. He backed Petro Poroshenko in 2014 or 15, who became president. With Soros' backing, immediately after he becomes president, he gives Soros the highest award in the country. Right after that, Soros is then appointed to the country's National Investment Board, and then he pledges to give a few more billion to the country. So it's in countries like that you can really see the progression of his influence and how it benefits him directly. And it's even popped up more. So Soros has, and a lot of, you see this with liberal organizations, they're, I would say, ironically titled. They use words like justice, freedom, and all these things they don't really mean. But Soros has founded a number of, and you're going to laugh, anti-corruption organizations in Ukraine. So one is called ANT-AC, the Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Now, who is ANT-AC? Well, as I don't think I need to tell you, Hunter Biden had a job with Burisma, getting paid 83 grand a month in Ukraine. A prosecutor named Viktor Shokin decided, something's probably fishy here, I should look into this. And this is the prosecutor who Joe Biden very famously bragged about withholding aid to Ukraine, got the prosecutor fired. Well, as Biden was doing this behind the scenes, ANT-AC was very publicly calling for this prosecutor to be fired. So he was doing the bidding, this is an election year, he was doing the bidding, knowing this would benefit Joe Biden in the end. There's another anti-corruption organization, also still ironically titled, called the OORCP that he founded. And both these groups, by the way, work with the FBI and CIA, so his influence is going there. But this second group was actually cited 4 times in the Trump impeachment document. As you'll recall, was from a very perfect, I'll be short, phone call in Ukraine. And that whole thing, I mean, I'm going to go off on a tangent for a bit here, but the whole narrative about the impeachment, the timeline doesn't match up. So we were told Trump has this phone call with the leader of Ukraine. He's told, to expose the whole Biden connection, or else he's going to withhold aid. Well, the aid that was withheld since February. This phone call was in June, and there was news articles back in February about the aid being withdrawn, and they just said they didn't think it was necessary. So if you think the aid was withheld as a quid pro quo, you have to believe this was planned, was it 6 or 7 months in advance of this phone call. So the timeline never really matched up. But that's obviously not very convenient for the media to say. Now, for one of the strongest, and I was sort of researching his history with the State Department. He was, very much in touch with Hillary Clinton. I even have emails, I can't think WikiLeaks got them, where he could literally tell Hillary, hey, I think this is the best person for a position, and then the next day they get the job. So a lot of influence there, but Antony Blinken seems to has the most connection to Soros out of the Biden White House. He is our Secretary of State. In fact, when he became Secretary of State, the newspapers in both Hungary and Albania said it was a very good day for the Soros empire. And it shows up, so one of the weird oddities of writing about politics is the people you meet, and I ended up meeting the former president of Albania, who was the first president after the communist regime fell. It's ironic, again, ironically titled the Democratic Party of Albania, but they mean democratic as anti-communist. It's a right-wing party. A very interesting country, actually. There's a lot of they like our they clearly see us as a bastion of freedom, the way we do. There was, when I was there, a lot of streets named after Reagan and Bush and Trump even. I saw one MAGA hat, a lot of American flags. They even have, someone there likes our GOP, so there's a Republican Party of Albania that pretty much mimics the US GOP and has 3 seats in their parliament, and is partnered with their Democratic Party. which is, as I mentioned, is right-wing. So this guy Berisha was their first non-communist president in the 90s. And he explained to me that Soros, he almost took this sort of the drug cartel model, the Pablo Escobar model of you're a crook, but you're charitable in your local area. You build schools, you build hospitals, you're a man of the people. And Soros would ingratiate himself with locals and pretty much just be giving money away, but it was to then try to later gain influence. And he said, well, after we realized that, he kind of became persona non grata. So this guy has had, let's say, a 2-decade, 3-decade-long feud with Soros ever since then. And right as Antony Blinken takes office, the first thing he does is sanction this guy, Sali Berisha. Now, Blinken, as I mentioned, the Hungarian press and Albanian press called him. I said it was good news for Soros that he got the position. And the reason why is because his parents are very, very closely tied to Soros. So Soros has a university that he started called Central European University in Hungary. It's since been kicked out. But there was a library there named after Blinken's parents because they're such big donors to the university. If you look through the Open Society Foundation, it reads like a corporate report. Every year they list their operations, what they spend money on, and they have the names of all the people on the organization. And I haven't checked the most recent ones, but the ones I looked at maybe 10 or so years ago, I think they're listed in names of importance. It is George Soros is the first name, and Blinken's parents, I think, were the second or third name. So these are very closely tied people. And then I started looking into what was the reason why he sanctioned this guy? So there was all these claims of corruption, and I thought, okay, well, let's read about them. There's no details. So the source of the claim is this group called the East-West Management Institute, and it's based in Azerbaijan, which you'd think, okay, well, who the heck is relevant in Azerbaijan? Well, it was co-founded by George Soros, and this is the most interesting part. The woman who runs it is a woman named Diana Fizo. She was engaged to the current prime minister of Albania, who's a socialist and also opposes Berisha. So we have an enemy of Berisha, Soros. He works through Antony Blinken, who's getting source material from another opponent of Berisha. So it was just it's very easy to kind of point out the chain of corruption there. And it was interesting, too, that they made the point to me that one of the things Soros tried to do there very early on was infiltrate their court system, just to make it easier to bypass. And that's really the latest phase of what he's doing in America. I think I might be sort of beating a dead horse, but I think this is the most commonly reported on thing about Soros today. But all these state prosecutors becoming household names is I think unprecedented. I mean, most people don't know their mayors, but they'll know who Chesa Boudin is, or Kimberly Gardner, who went after the McCloskeys, or George Gascon, really Kip Gardner. I mean, the list really goes on very, very long. And they all have the same philosophy. It's America's racist, police are awful, criminals are the real victims somehow. And we had a controlled experiment in 2020 where we basically gave handed over the keys to the inmates, and they cut the police forces, and in almost all these places, crime pretty much doubled. What I think is most interesting, though, and it shows sort of the post-truth era we're living in, is that a lot of these cities have reversed course. They've not entirely refunded their police, but they've tried to hire them back. And while they publicized cutting police as this great social justice measure, now that they realize they've done the wrong thing, they're not publicizing hiring them back, meaning they'll privately do the right thing and publicly do the wrong thing. And it's just a very bizarre phenomenon to see. Now, Soros' influence, too, in the one order extends far beyond that. In fact, in Europe, he has their highest court, I guess their equivalent of a Supreme Court, is the European Court of Human Rights. I think it's 4 justices on that court he has some sort of influence with. And there's a number of cases that have gone his way because of them. Now, one notable case that did not go his way, and I think it just shows how strong the charges were against him, was he was charged and convicted of insider trading in France back in the early 2000s. He appealed to that court that he has a lot of influence on, and even they threw out his case. So it seems that it's probably ended up doing that, and if he did it once, I would imagine he did it a bunch of other times. One of the things, too, about his hedge fund is if you invested $1 million with him when it started, you'd have something like $2 billion today. Now, you can bust out a retirement calculator. Obviously, money compounds, but a 2,000-fold return is not exactly something you see every day. Now, also in Europe, there was a dossier leaked, and I have a whole chapter actually in the book on leaked documents from Soros, where it was basically just a list of every member of European Parliament under his control. And it basically was like a business card. It was, here's the guy, here's the issues he aligns with us on, here's his number, his fax, his email, everything. And there's about 277 people on that list. Now, European Parliament has 705 seats. So if Soros were his own political party, the people he influenced, it would be the largest party in European Parliament. And you know, my first thought was, well, that's a dossier of Europe that just happened to get leaked. What's the one in America look like? You know, even in the Biden White House, I mean, the Center for American Progress, there's a lot of people linked to. Soros is, I think, the biggest donor to them. So I would assume a very large amount as well, especially in the more progressive people. What else? I guess sort of more to touch back on the whole law and order stuff. You know, Soros donated around $50 million to Black Lives Matter during the height of the chaos. And I don't know if this is an odd thought to have, but there's sort of a silver lining that all that money might have been wasted on someone's mansion. And that, like, that's the thing. Everyone's saying, you know, these people need to be held accountable. And I'm going, they just stole $50 million from some gullible liberals and got a house out of it. I mean, I don't know if it's the worst thing in the world, to be honest. But that's sort of where they're going, and it's, again, a sort of this post-truth reality they want us to live in, where, I mean, we have, the Washington Post has the numbers, there's, I think, 12 unarmed black people killed by cops every year, there's 10,000 black people killed by other black people, and listen, I acknowledge that if you have any institution, there's going to be error, margin of error. So if you have cops, yes, things are going to go wrong, but it's, the thing going wrong is 12 people, the ones they can prevent is 10,000. So it's just the ratio is not in whack. You know, in every city where you know, the murder rate has doubled, it's just simply not the case that you could reduce police violence enough to offset that. But you know, by a factor of probably 100. And again, it sort of ties into this sort of, I don't know, this goal of destabilizing trust in all of our institutions. One of the things people ask me a lot is, like, what is his end game? What is the goal? And I tried not to, you know, psychoanalyze people, A, because I'm not a psychologist, and B, I've never really met the guy, but I do think, and I normally try to, especially with a rank and file liberal, try to, you know, empathize with, you might believe the wrong thing, but I can see where you're coming from. That's really not the case with him. Everything he does is you don't have to be a genius to see where all this stuff is going. And just the random stuff he funds. I mean, he's funding a lot of the transgender movement. Now, why is a 91-year-old taking interest in transgender politics? And, well, it's just the latest way to demonize people. And the left does this with every consecutive issue is, whatever the latest issue is, this is the most important issue that has ever existed and will ever exist. And all these issues before that we could debate, but this one issue is the biggest one ever. And in the past, you know, few years, this has become the big one where they can just demonize us for accepting reality, basically. You know, I think of myself as a generally polite person. You know, like, if you want me to call you a girl, I guess I won't argue with it. But it's getting to the point where I actually have to mentally pretend that. And we're just increasingly getting to a point where words have no meaning. And this is actually largely beneficial to the left. I mean, you just see it with their language. I mean, words are violence and punching people is peaceful. I can just go through a whole list of these. Let's see what else. Anything else I should cover here? Let's see. Let's see. Oh, another thing too I wanted to cover is, I get asked this in every interview, and every liberal has used it against me. They'll make the argument that to criticize George Soros is anti-Semitic. And I remember once, I said in an interview, and I was totally being serious, I was like, I didn't even know he was Jewish. And then Media Matters clipped it like I'm an idiot. And I'm like, it's not the first thing I look about a person. So I was honestly unaware, and he's not even practicing, but I'm always saying to these people, I'm like, what are your thoughts on Sheldon Adelson? I mean, I don't recall a single Republican saying, well, if you're against him, you're anti-Semitic. But it's largely a media narrative that he has fueled himself, and that, you know, in the book I have the list of Soros-backed publications where, you know, if you go through them and you just do an advanced search for George Soros on their site, any mention, most criticism, that is the default dismissal. And it's just an evolution of everything is racist, so we can dismiss you that way. Now, and I guess I'll sort of wrap up with this, and if I'm finishing up way too early, I will do extra questions. How do we defeat Soros? Now, He's obviously 91 years old. I don't know how much longer he's going to be around for. But one of the things he has done is, and I think it's succession planning, he made what I think actually has the record for the biggest, and using quotation marks here, charitable contribution of all time. So he's spent $30 billion of his own money throughout his career. He's donated $20 billion or so to his own foundation from his hedge fund, and I guess the media reports it as a big charitable endeavor. I think it's just setting up his son to run the organization. One sort of unreported part about this is it gives Soros also, I think, the biggest tax loophole in history, in that he now has $20 billion he moves from his hedge fund to his charitable group. So he pays no tax on any capital gains from that, since it's mostly stocks and stuff. And then because he made that charitable donation basically to himself, for the next 5 years he gets to write off $20 billion against any future income. Now, the only place I saw even come close to covering this was ProPublica, which is funded by George Soros. And they did a very, very extensive essay on billionaires not paying taxes. They covered Bezos, Musk, any billionaire you can think of. And I don't even agree with the premise. They're basically just saying, like, we should tax unrealized capital gains, which I don't think is a good idea. But my point being, they devote maybe 1,000 to 3,000 words per person in that report. You scroll down to Soros, and there's 2 paragraphs. So it's just, hey, he made all this money, he didn't pay taxes. Then the second paragraph is someone from his organization saying, oh, well, we didn't make any money that year, so we didn't pay taxes. Now, Soros' fund is big enough where they have to report to the SEC, and guess what? They made money that year. The reason they didn't pay taxes is because he had that charitable contribution to carry over. So you would think, any other publication would do the due diligence, which you go on the SEC's website, it takes maybe 5 minutes to find, but no one really bothered to do that. Now, one of the ways I think we could really help stymie his influence would be sort of to borrow, I don't know if it's a leftist tactic, but there are certain people who will just dismiss me by saying, you on Fox News, we can't trust you. And I'm just saying, why don't we do that with Soros' groups? Why don't we just make it where his groups are a synonym for being untrustworthy, being billionaire-backed, being sinister and evil? And that's why I have this list at the end of the book of all the major publications that Soros has funded and had a role in. And these are ones that he's donated 6 figures, 7 figures plus to. I mean, the full list would probably be the length of the book. But that's really, I think, the only way to go forward is draw as much attention to this guy and really just do everything you can to discredit him and show the destruction he's caused against the world. And for that, I guess we'll open you up to questions.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we now have an opportunity to ask Matt questions, and as you can tell, he's shy and has nothing to say. So please write your questions on your index card, if you will. Ushers will pick them up on the side of the aisle and bring them to me to vet if you would do that. Just hold your hand up in the air. And Matt,
yes.
I always get to ask the first question, which is kind of my favorite thing. Has this guy ever produced a good or a service that someone has paid for with full knowledge and transparency of what they're buying?
No, I mean, the only exception would be the other millionaires and billionaires who invest with him, who've obviously done very well, probably due to some shady financial malfeasance. But besides that, no, he's never produced anything, and even his political influence. I mean, if I had $40 billion, everyone's saying about Elon Musk, he's spending all this money on Twitter, why isn't he helping the homeless? No one will say that about Soros, who, at least openly tries to project this image of that kind of person.
There's some already questions about what is inspiring this guy, and you touched on that a little bit, but you called him a sociopath. So I don't think you have to be a professional to know that sociopaths they're not satisfied because they're interested in money and power. And there's sort of you think, well, they'll have enough money and they'll be done, but that's actually not how the sociopathic mind works. Do you want to say a little bit more about the drive at 91?
Well, yeah.
And by the way, has he instilled that in his family so that this keeps going on?
Yeah, the foundation is largely a family affair. In fact, there is in the book I have colleges he's infiltrated, and one of them basically he bought his wife her own department out of college, and now his ex-wife, but she's still in that position. And yes, Soros is someone where too much is never enough. As I mentioned earlier, his goal was to make $100 million, and he thought he'd stop there. He went up to $40 billion. And I guess this is probably armchair psychology for me, but it does seem that especially people who are sort of on the top of society, they enjoy power for the sake of power and influence for the sake of influence. It's, even easy to see going on a TV show how exciting that may be and how good it may feel to influence a small number of people. And when you're doing that to the tunes of billions of dollars and I think in the book the estimate is he reaches, this is actually 10 years old, this estimate was conducted. I think 300 million people a month are reading some sort of publication that Soros backed. And just from the quotes in the book I provide about him and his own ego, I think that kind of just explains it. It's all really about him ultimately. And in fact, I mean, I think if he were put in a position where he had to support the opposite politics, I think he would do it just to maintain control. And I mean, I might complain a bit less about him, and he would never do that. But I do think that's the kind of guy he is.
Okay. There are a couple of questions about connections. One is to his connection to the Tides Foundation, and another one is Kamala Harris's relationship with George Soros' son. Do you have any information about that?
I don't know about the son, but the Tides organization, it's interesting because Soros, a lot of his influence is very direct. He just donates to a group directly. Tides is one of those groups where it's sort of like influencing of influencing, where he'll donate to Tides and then they'll donate to various groups. I don't know if, I mean, my first inclination was maybe he's trying to launder exactly what he's influencing, but I don't think he's the kind of guy who would stray away from that. But yeah, that's I think one of the biggest in terms of dollar amount he funds, and in that effect, he's sort of outsourcing some of his influence from them to pick where they want the money to go. But they're I mean, pretty much ideologically aligned identically with him.
Okay. Is it true that you can't say the name George Soros on Fox?
I'm planning on making a joke about it when I go on Fox to promote the book. I know you're referring to the Gingrich Faulkner thing, and what was the most confusing was Newt wasn't even saying anything remotely controversial. He wasn't pitching some far-out conspiracy. He was just saying he funds these races, which Fox's website reports on. So I don't know. It almost seemed like it was an earpiece thing, and I have no idea what explained that. I mean, I could just ask him, I guess, but yeah.
How can we tell who he's influencing in terms of these prosecutors, these shadow organizations? How can the average person understand who is where he is behind the candidates?
So, I mean, fortunately, all this is public information, and it is widely reported on, in Fox, even though they won't talk about it. And I guess I'm supposed to plug the book. The longest chapter is called Soros Goes Local. And the intro is just about why he's sort of decided to go local, and that you get a lot more bang for your buck. If I had $100 million to spend on a presidential election, even I probably couldn't move the needle just because there's so many billions spent. But when you go to the local level and there's usually $100,000 spent on a candidate, if you spend $1 million, it's going to be a lot easier to move the needle there. So in the book, basically, I divide it by state, and then I just have every candidate, and I do it. I mean, almost like baseball stats. I have here's who they are, here's the funding, here's their ideology, their sales pitch of here's why we need these reforms, and then I have here's what actually happened. And they try to phrase it like, oh my God, we got people going to jail for pot, we need to stop this. And then all of a sudden murderers aren't going to jail. So it's the sales pitch versus reality just could not be any further apart.
It's like baseball pitch, but without the hot dogs and the fun. Okay. So some more questions about Soros' son. Is he just as bad as his dad? And how can he be exposed?
I mean, I would just say everything I'm saying about Soros, just apply it to him. He is the one who seems to be, I mean, at least physically, jet-setting around the most. I mean, when I was in Albania to promote the book, he was staying in the same hotel as me and rejected a request for a meeting with me. Don't know why. But yeah, so that's, I don't know, she's not really thrilled with my work, which hopefully is a good sign.
Matt, would you tell the story that you told at dinner about the picture you have?
Which one?
The photograph of the book signing.
Oh, yeah, so I went on, it was, I mean, the biggest opinion show in the country, and I don't think it's aired yet. They're waiting to strategically time it. But the host interviewed Soros back in 2005, so he has framed, on the entrance of the studio, that's just framed photos of the interviews. So he has one, and he's, holding the book as Soros is signing it. So we got a new photo of me in front of that photo, of me signing my anti-Soros book in front of Soros, and then they put that picture next to the Soros picture.
That's so great. That's so great. Okay, here's a question about Myanmar, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but did Soros' son corrupt the election in Myanmar? Should we support the Myanmar junta's counter-coup against the Soros-backed winners?
I don't have anything about that in the book, so I'm actually not sure. I don't go into as much detail with the Asian stuff, unfortunately, so I'm sorry I don't have a more satisfying answer there.
Okay. One of my favorite things is a speaker who says, I don't know, right? It's refreshing in this time. How about a connection, two more questions about connections. Klaus Schwab, and of course, the CCP.
Yeah, these people are all sort of ingrained, and Soros has actually recently been trying to portray this image that he's in opposition to President Xi and the CCP. Now you'd think, all right, they've had human rights abuses for the past 100+ years. Why, of all times, is the year 2022 when Soros is speaking out against the CCP? Well, he has some investments in China that have gone very awry because of the CCP. So he was a big investor in Alibaba, which is kind of like their Amazon.com. They've had these weird incidences where their CEO has just disappeared for months at a time, and I'm assuming the government's behind that, but that's hurt their stock price a lot, which Soros is at least at one point, one of the biggest holders in. There was another company called Didi, which is sort of like their version of Uber, the ride-hailing company. And he was a very big investor in it before it went public. And then when it went public, I mean, it almost seemed like it was on purpose, the Chinese government started to crack down on them, and the stock price went down like 80% within a few weeks, which is kind of unprecedented with IPOs. But Soros lost, I think, over $1 billion on that. So he's now trying to portray himself as the enemy of the CCP. As for the Schwab people and Gates, I mean, all these billionaires more or less know each other and have a very shared ideology. How they frame their agenda is just different. I mean, Bill Gates tries to more explicitly frame it in philanthropic terms, but I don't really buy it. And one of the questions I've gotten too is like, what differentiates Soros from these other billionaires? And I actually don't really think much. I think there is this weird, I mean, the left seems to think that all rich people are Republicans, but if you look at, I mean, at least the Obama era onward, all the elites are on the left. There was a chart I saw where they looked at, like, I think it was the 100 most influential organizations in America. I don't know how they ranked it, but it was like universities, police departments, certain corporations, and 97% of them, most of the donations went to Biden. 3 of them, I think one was, the NYPD was the biggest one, all the donations went to Trump. So it's just, I don't know, the left has really gained an enormous amount of institutional power in an area that stereotypically is supposed to be dominated by us, but has not been for quite a while.
So let me just get this straight. So the Republicans are supposed to be all the wealthy ones, and the Democrats defended slavery, right? Okay.
Pretty much.
Okay. The spin is always very confusing to me. Okay. You just mentioned Hoover,
Yes.
and they hosted George Soros recently as a philanthropist. Do you want to speak to that institution?
I don't know. I mean, I have a lot less faith in a lot of the think tanks I followed growing up. A lot of the right-wing think tanks like Cato, I sort of fear are not controlled opposition, but sort of advanced pro-business interests by using conservatism as a Trojan horse or a cloak and framing things in terms of liberty when they're really not. And I mean, I don't know how Hoover has personally benefited if he's donated. I guess I'll have to look into that immediately afterwards. But I would assume that's the most likely, is he's had some sort of influence there, directly or indirectly, and that's why they're hosting him. Although I should probably watch the event to make sure it's not, I think, critical of him, or to see how it went, I guess.
Okay. So there's a little confusion, and I think this is purposeful. You say he kind of sounds like a libertarian on paper, and the question from the audience is, can you say anything else about his philosophical background? Not to ask you to psychoanalyze him, but they're curious if you have additional insight about sort of what supports his specific policies.
Well, what supports the specific policies, I mean, truly is nothing. And the thing is, the open society, I mean, that was sort of my interpretation of its, I mean, listen, we all know liberals use language. Words mean nothing to these people. They'll throw out things like, I mean, they were chanting outside Alito's home, abortion saves lives. So these are the people we're dealing with. So my interpretation of, like, that's a tough thing. What he described as the open society, I'm going, well, that's America. And then he's saying, no, this is the opposite of America. So it's just very hard to know exactly what it is. And I don't really see a coherent ideology throughout all his actions. I mean, how do you justify defund the police? Like, what exactly is the ideology besides one of destruction? There's like, the one question I always ask liberals is, what's the theory? Okay, so your problem is racist cops. What's the theory for why cutting their funding helps that? So you have racist cops that are paid less? Like, is that your best case scenario? What exactly is the theory for how this helps? And these questions never get answered. And I mean, the left's activism, to a large extent, exists for the sake of activism, where everything is open-ended. I mean, Glenn Greenwald, who I think you probably see on Tucker a lot, pointed out recently, he's gay, he pointed out, he's like, well, what's more successful in the gay rights movement? Yet they act like there's been no progress made since the 70s. And it's this weird thing you see on the left where activism is just for the sake of activism. They get some weird fulfillment from it, and even when they meet the goalpost just changes to here's some weird, obscure thing we need to tackle next. Like if the country was 50% white and 50% black, and they said, all right, we need every profession to be 50% white and 50% black. The second we hit that, they're going to go, okay, well, what percent are right-handed and left-handed? What percent have blue eyes and brown eyes? There's an infinite amount of ways you can subdivide a society, and they'll just turn to that next one next. So. I hope that sort of answers, but I mean, the ultimate answer is it's very hard to say because there is no logic behind anything he does other than influence for the sake of it.
Okay,
Yeah.
so because it seems like there's a question from the audience, why does he hate this country so much? But I'm not sure he specifically hates this country more than the other ones that he's kind of helped unravel, like betting against the pound, right?
Well, that's the thing. He doesn't give any examples of, well, what is the perfect country you want us to strive to? So there really is no quantifiable, okay, here's what we're trying to get to. And I think also on purpose.
Yeah, so it's sort of demoral, destabilize, and then get people to crave the rescue, as they say, right?
Yeah, I mean, I hope this is sort of on topic. I mean, I think there's definitely a concerted effort to federalize power in certain countries. Obviously, when people are less reliant on each other, they want to be more dependent on the federal government, and this does help people like Soros. And I think one potential goal of him being in the defund the police movement, for instance, is to federalize police, to give them less autonomy. And we saw this recently when the Senate, and I think Biden signed it, passed an anti-lynching bill. And there were liberals reporting on it as if lynching was legal until a month ago. We have laws against murder. They fortunately cover this kind of thing. So there's no point for the law other than to federalize power, make it a federal crime, give less autonomy to local areas, ironically where he now controls a lot of power. But I think that is the next step, is further federalizing and concentrating power.
Okay. Is there any evidence that he's involved with human trafficking?
Not that I know of, but if anyone has any, please tell me so I can do an entire book on it.
I'm not sure I understand this question, but it says, from your Debunk This book, did you find ties to Soros?
So Soros wasn't really as much on my radar at that point. That book was mainly kind of a culmination of fact checks I did for the Dan Bongino show. Dan would sort of reach out to me whenever he wanted a particular thing researched he didn't have time for, and that's what I wrote a lot of them on my own as well. But no, it's just a collection of essays I put together, and I don't recall Soros being mentioned in the book at all. And hopefully I would remember if he was, but.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, any chance that there's going to be, there's reason to prosecute him? Is there anybody who can legitimately take him, quote, take him down is the words that the audience is using?
I think he's more careful in our country just because, I mean, obviously there's corruption in every country, but we have more law and order than others. But there are countries he has been thrown out of, and he's been expelled from Hungary, which is his country of birth. In fact, the president ran a large anti-Soros campaign where if you walked onto a public bus, there would be a photo of Soros on the floor for everyone to step on. And his biographer said that was the one thing he's ever seen that bothered him. So very successful there. What was I saying? Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Can you repeat the question? It was... all right, sorry about that.
Any force?
Oh, sorry.
Anybody
In other countries.
challenge him?
So a number of countries have basically accused his NGOs of, as I mentioned earlier, sort of infiltrating the country, claiming to be philanthropic, and then trying to influence the courts, local politics. I can't think of any prosecutions, but there has been cases where the NGOs have been thrown out, their assets seized. I told the Albanians to do that, and they thought it was a very good idea, so hopefully they follow my lead. Obviously we can't do that in America, but we can draw attention, we can heavily criticize and investigate these institutions. Or I should rephrase that. Actually, we can do that in America. We just have to investigate them thoroughly.
Matt, you're connected and know some very powerful people and kind of the who's who of the conservative movement right now. Are you hopeful in the face of this unbelievable level of organization, the breadth and the depth that I read about in your book? Are you hopeful that we can challenge this while we run around with little yard signs about dog catcher?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, and the left has really monopolized every institution, every platform. if you're not on Twitter, good for you. It's hell on earth. But a lot of the discourse, almost all journalism nowadays originates on Twitter. Every myth you see about Trump is started there and makes its way into the media. I do have some hope with, I mean, listen, I get Elon Musk's not the perfect guy. I don't even think he's necessarily right wing, but I think just an equal playing field there will make an enormous difference. I mean, there's already, and I can't prove it, but it used to be you'd see a lot of left-wing narratives, accounts promoted in your feed, even if you're a right-winger. That seems to have gone away. It seems like conservatives are getting more engagement. And it seems like they're not being preferred. It's just that this is what happens when there's a more equal playing field. So I don't think we need to cheat like they do. I think our ideas are just better. And you know, the reason they make their ideas beyond criticism is because they fall apart with the greatest, the smallest degree of scrutiny. I mean, they sort of use like the Bart Simpson argumentation where they go, trans women are women, as if just saying that over and over becomes true. And I'm going, well, that's a self-refuting statement. You're naming two different things and saying they're the same. Anyway, it's just a bit of a tangent, sorry.
That's okay.
All right.
We're enjoying it. Okay. It's a question about how we can get the media back to true journalism. I think there's true journalism around you. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, you know, I think the left will often, when there's a lot of people in a group, like, you know, more white people than black, will say, oh, it's due to racism. You know, listen, people just have different interests. They just self-select into different groups. And right now it's the case that I think like 6% of journalists are Republicans. And I don't think it's because we're getting necessarily discriminated against, although there is obviously not as many right-wing publications, but I think conservatives just aren't quite as interested in it, and really just should be. I mean, you know, they say, you know, history is written by the winners, but history is being written right in front of us, and the left is writing it. You know, I know 20 years from now what my kid's textbook is going to say about Donald Trump, and it hasn't been written yet. You know they're going to rewrite the COVID the same way they rewrote slavery, where they went, oh, you know what, we were on the wrong side? Just kidding, it was actually us all along. They're doing that now with even like the school closures. The New York Times is going, wow, it's crazy that we even let that happen. What a disaster. And you know they're going to do this with lockdowns and try to make it like, you know, it was bad, but it would have been worse without us. So I do think just for history's sake, it's very important we get active, and we're just refuting as much as we possibly can.
So beyond time capsules, what are we going to do? I would like you to give our group some marching orders. We usually ask, what are three things? When you look at these people's faces, they're here because they're really dedicated to liberty. They want to pass it on. What are three concrete things they can do tonight?
Well, it may take longer than tonight, but
okay. All right, tomorrow.
All right. Well, one thing that's helped me a lot is just, I would just say read everything. You really never know, like, when the most trivial piece of information is going to come in handy to, you know, kind of spit back at someone. Get involved and do it locally. And do it smart. Like, you know, if you're in a blue state, like, you know, I'm in New Jersey, it might strategically make more sense for me to campaign for, you know, Trump in Pennsylvania compared to New Jersey, just because, you know, it's close to impossible to win that state. But ultimately go local. I mean, it seems like there's been, school boards have been nonpartisan for a long time, or at least claim to be. After a lot of this critical race theory stuff, there's been a conservative movement to take those over, and it's having a huge impact. And you know, it's the liberal narrative's ingrained from, sort of day one of public education, and reversing that is going to have a huge effect on just the momentum of how people think and the momentum of history. As for a third one, I feel like it'd be too cliche to say get out and vote, but obviously that's a big one. I would say, of Soros in particular and these kind of people, just educate yourself on these networks and do all you can just to promote that these people are not reliable. Not to be too self-promotional, but the most damning parts of the book about Soros, the most damning quotes, try to make those like a household knowledge. I think it's kind of the best thing we can do.
Do you have any specific advice for young people, for young conservatives, for anybody young who cares about freedom?
I would say people want to give you more opportunity than you can think, or than you think. There is really no shortage of left-wing publications, and if you're a liberal and want to go into that, you'll find some rag to hire you. On the right, while there is less conservative media, it's much more close-knit. People are more willing to help each other out. I mean, I got my first job in politics because I worked in finance and hated it and emailed Alan West and told him to, I mean, I didn't say rescue me, but kind of what he ended up doing. And he got used, I mean, I think I emailed him, Adam Carolla, Neil Cavuto, and like someone else on Fox. West got back to me. And then I just started writing for him for a few years. Dan Bongino had seen my columns and got in touch with me, and then I've been working with him for a while. And yeah, just really try to meet and network with as many people as possible, because it is crazy how tight-knit, how everyone really does know each other, and just the people you can meet that way.
Yeah. Matt, we are so thankful for you. You know, the people who say that this generation is lazy has not met Matt Palumbo, that is for sure. Matt, would you be willing to visit with some people, stick around for a little bit for some questions? Okay, well, we're going to wind up the official part of the program, but we really, several things. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I want you all to get out of your comfort zone for liberty. I'm way out of my comfort zone right now, and that's just really simply what it's going to take. So don't share our videos, bring a friend next time. Some of you did tonight, and I'm so glad you did that. Make calls, write emails, do what you need to do. But don't come back without having done something for liberty, because that will mean you didn't get out of your comfort zone, and I'm going to give you a hard time. Okay? Hope that you will renew your membership or join tonight. That's how we bring you these great speakers like Matt Palumbo. We can't do it without you. We have a beautiful new webpage for instructions about donations that Dave Grobart has made for us, and I hope that you'll check that out. We want to see you next month. Next month, we are going to talk about election integrity, election fraud. It's going to be just terrific, and there'll be more about that on our website that you can register soon. So thank you all for being with us tonight. If you want to hang out and have a Guinness with Matt, we'll corral him in the back here. And oh, you should totally buy his book. Thank you. You should totally buy Matt's book. Yeah, absolutely. It is a really, really good read. You can get it in paperback. You could have it in your hand tomorrow. And the back of it is just going to knock you out. So get his book. Okay? Matt, thank you so much for a wonderful talk.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Matt Palumbo.
Where do I put this thing?